26.9 is the biggest meta-shifting patch that we've seen all season long, as there are new items being added, new runes are coming, items are being reworked, and we've got big updates for Zeri and Shyvana, so there's a ton to cover in this one, and we'll get you guys all set up with everything you need to know for 26.9, along with an update to the tier list for every single role. And remember, our tier list will always show you the most broken champions in the meta, but knowing what's broken doesn't mean that you know how to abuse it, which is exactly why countless players love our live challenger commentaries. Every single week, our challenger experts upload full live games, walking you through exactly how to carry in your own ranked games, from how to win trades in lane, to making the right macro calls in the mid game, and how to dominate team fights, breaking down every key decision they make in real time, to make sure you know exactly how to play every stage of the game step by step on your chosen champion. And if you still have questions, our coaches are, let's just say, compelled to answer them. And that's only the start, as we've updated our Season 16 Essentials courses for every role, breaking down how to play every stage of the game into easy-to-digest chapters, giving you all the tips, tricks, and strategies you need to climb this season, guaranteed. As if you don't climb at least 5 divisions while actively using our service, then you get every penny back. So what's there to lose? Get your exclusive one-time discount by clicking the link in the pinned comment or description below and start your climb today. So let's start the video by covering all the rune changes. Then we'll discuss the items, and after that, we'll go over the champion changes role by role. Arcane Comet is going to receive a mini rework, with its base damage going down from 30 scaling to 130 to 15 scaling to 100. However, there is a new effect being added so that if you are 750 units away from your opponent, then the damage from Comet will be increased by 100%. So what this means is that as long as you are 750 units away, then this is a neutral change early on and a buff later. So which champions are likely to benefit from this change, and which may look to swap to an alternative keystone? Ziggs, Hwei, Vel'Koz, Morgana, Lux, Mel, and Xerath are all very likely to be loving these changes and continue running Comet. Rumble, Neeko, Malphite, Malzahar, Lissandra, and Heimerdinger are most likely to dislike the direction of Comet, since they are going to be closer than 750 units from their target when they are proccing Comet a lot of the time. Mal, Liss, and Neeko in specific are often right up next to their opponent when they dive into a fight, so we'll have to keep close track as to whether Comet is even optimal on them anymore. A brand new rune being added to the sorcery tree for 26.9 is called Deathfire Touch. The tooltip reads that damaging abilities against enemy champions will deal 4 scaling to 12 plus 8% bonus AD and 3% AP adaptive damage per second. After burning for 3 seconds, this damage is increased by 100%. The burn lasts a different amount of time depending on the type of ability used. Single target spells will burn for 4 seconds, AoE spells will burn for 2 seconds, persistent damage spells will burn for 1 second, and pet damage will burn for 1 second. So the big thing here, and the champs that will see the most success with Deathfire, are the ones who can take advantage of that 100% boost in damage the most. You've got to burn the enemy for 3 seconds to get the 100% boost in damage. So we're looking at Cassiopeia, Anivia, Karthus, Malzahar, Brand, Zyra, Swain, Ryze, Rumble, Udyr, Singed, and Azir to be the most likely to find the best success with Deathfire Touch. With all this in mind, we crunched some numbers, and it looks like champs who can just go Conqueror will still like the rune better than Deathfire Touch. Conqueror will deal more damage in an extended fight and also has the heal, so for Cassio, Swain, Ryze, and Rumble, we wouldn't be surprised if Deathfire is just not that optimal for them. One of the big changes of the patch is the removal of Phase Rush as a rune and being replaced by a new version called Storm Raiders Surge. Storm Raiders will also be a movement speed rune, however, the way in which you proc the movement speed is much different than Phase Rush. With Phase Rush, all you'd have to do is hit your opponent with 3 damaging effects to gain the movement speed proc, but Storm Raiders will work so that you need to deal 25% of the enemy's max health to gain 40% movement speed and 50% slow resist for 3 seconds. So instead of being a hit and run and kite away type of rune, Storm Raiders is going to reward more aggressive play. We honestly think that Storm Raiders will just be a weaker version of Phase Rush though, because the fact you actually need to deal damage in order to proc the movement speed limits the reliability of the rune. For instance, if you're playing someone like Orianna and are trying to evade an early gank, using an auto Q and then W is not going to deal 25% of the enemy's health bar. We did a little bit of testing on the PBE, and here's what we found. Orianna's combo of using a Q, W, and auto attack at level 3 with a Doran's Ring is going to deal 196 damage. It's very standard for champions to have around 30 armor and 30 magic resist at level 3, so that's what we gave the target dummy. Instead of the 1000 health that the dummy has though, let's pretend it's got 900, which is the same as what Orianna has at level 3. So if you deal 196 damage against a target who has 900 health, that is 21.7% of their max health, which is short of the 25% needed. So that means you would either have to auto a second time or make sure that Orianna's E goes through the target in order to proc Storm Raiders Surge. And if you're thinking, well, just make sure to pull your E through the enemy then and you're fine. But what if you just used your E in a trade for the shield? Or what if your ball isn't in the right angle to pull it through the enemy to hit them with the E? Basically, what we're trying to explain here is that Storm Raiders is going to be a lot less reliable than Phase Rush. In theory, you'd think that assassins would end up liking Storm Raiders the most, most. But then at the same time, if they like Storm Raiders, then wouldn't they have just liked Phase Rush even more? You do get more movement speed with Storm Raiders earlier on in the game with 40% for melee champs, while it was only 25% with Phase Rush, so that could be a deciding factor that shifts certain assassins onto the rune. Overall though, we are somewhat skeptical as to whether Storm Raiders is going to be an optimal keystone for a wide range of champs, so we'll be sure to keep you guys updated on that in our future meta videos. And then receiving a mini rework for this patch is going to be Hail of Blades, as you'll be getting less attack speed from the rune. However, each empowered attack will now deal 4 scaling to 20 plus 8% bonus AD and 6% AP bonus true damage. It's hard to say whether this will land net positive or negative, but we are leaning more towards it being a positive adjustment. So it's time for the item changes now, and a brand new starting item being added to the game is called Doran's Bow. The item will cost 400 gold and provide you with 6 AD, 15% attack speed, and 1.5% omnivamp. So champs who really like attack speed will be the ones who gravitate towards Doran's Bow. Could this be a Yasuo and Yone starting item now, since they both scale with attack speed really well? The major downside to this item though is that it doesn't provide any health at all. Doran's Blade is giving you 80 health, 4 more AD, and 1% more omnivamp, so is that 15% attack speed and the cost being 50 gold cheaper really worth the trade-off? Purely from a gold efficiency standpoint, it actually is, because the total gold value of the stats you're getting from Doran's Blade is worth 647 gold for an efficiency rating of 144%, while the total gold value of the stats from Doran's Bow is worth 635, and if you divide that by 400, you get the efficiency rating of 159%. So Doran's Bow is the more efficient item by 15%. Now, of course, using efficiency of all the stats as a guideline definitely isn't the best way to determine if you should build one over the other in all situations, because health will be more valuable than attack speed in certain matchups and vice versa. Even though Doran's Bow is more efficient, if you can't use the attack speed at all in the matchup and the enemy is just poking you from range, then you'd much rather just have the bonus health to survive better. So how we think about this shaking out is that Doran's Bow will be the more greedy starting option when you're in a matchup you're confident you can trade aggressively in early on, or if you feel you're in no danger of getting poked out. Doran's Blade will remain the default in matchups that are more even, or if you think the enemy has the ability to poke away at you early on in lane. And if you're playing a champ who just doesn't benefit much from attack speed, then we see no reason as to why you'd take Doran's Bow over Doran's Blade. That's why we think Yasuo and Yone are the two frontrunners to like the item the most, while a more spell-based fighter like Aatrox or Illaoi wouldn't even bother touching it. So for instance, if you were playing Yasuo against Orianna, you likely would stick with Doran's Blade so you can survive her early poke threat. If you're against a Veigar though, who doesn't pose nearly as much of an early threat, then that's where you can get away with Doran's Bow. Doran's Helm is the second new starting item, and it's going to offer up 110 health, 10 armor, 10 magic resist, and a passive that gives you 5 bonus physical damage on hit to minions. So this is going to be a competitor to Doran's Shield. The main difference between Doran's Shield and Doran's Helm is that Helm is giving you resist, while Shield is giving you sustain. So then the question becomes, will the damage you negate from the resist outweigh the sustain you get from Doran's Shield? Over the course of an entire lane phase, and if the enemy is constantly poking you, the sustain from Doran's Shield will be providing you with more effective health. So what it's really going to come down to is whether or not you feel you need the sustain for your matchup. If you're a melee versus ranged, then you will definitely want to continue taking Doran's Shield. If you're melee versus melee though, and know that you have the upper hand of the matchup and the enemy is very unlikely to be poking you at all, then Doran's Helm would be superior. Champions who have the ability to scale off of armor or magic resist will be the best with Doran's Helm. So think Malphite, Poppy, Ornn, and Cassante. They would definitely want to consider Doran's Helm in less volatile matchups. There are some new boots being added to the game for 26.9, and they're called Gluttonous Greaves. These will be a more offensive type of boots for 950 gold. You will receive 45 movement speed, 4% omnivamp, and a passive that gives you 1% omnivamp for each takedown on enemy champions, up to 6% at 6 takedowns. So a few champions you may want to experiment with these new boots include Aatrox, Kayn, Illaoi, and Vladimir. Keep in mind, if you're taking Gluttonous Greaves, it does mean you're missing out on the defensive strength of SkillCapped or Merc Treads, so it'd be hard to justify Gluttonous being the optimal boots choice in every game. Maybe Aatrox would want them regardless of enemy comp, but if the enemy team just has 3 auto-reliant AD champs, there's no way Gluttonous would be providing more value for you than SteelCaps. An item that will be receiving a rework for 26.9 is Static Shiv. The Shiv in 26.8 would give you 45 AD, 30% attack speed, and 4% movement speed along with a passive for a cost of 2,700 gold. The reworked Shiv will give you 40 AD, 40 AP, 30% attack speed, and 4% movement speed along with its passive for a cost of 3,000 gold. The passive is being changed on Shiv though, as it will no longer have a cooldown and proc on your next 3 attacks, and instead will be an energized attack and instantly proc on your first auto. Moving and basic attacking will generate energized stacks, while attacking grants 9 bonus stacks so that it's stronger on champs who auto more in fights. There is a new effect being added to the passive to where the Chain of Lightning will also apply your on-hit effects to targets other than the primary primary target. The champ running Shiv the most in 26.8 was Ukshin, and he most likely swaps off of Shiv for 26.9. Ukshin just won't benefit from the AP that the item provides, as he has just 1 AP ratio in his kit, so you're paying for a lot of stats that you just won't use if you end up building static Shiv now. This is some really interesting interactions, as we can see that with Xin Zhao, if you proc Shiv while your passive is ready, then you're going to get a massive heal. This doesn't work with Shin's Q though, in the sense that if Shiv procs when your third Q goes off, you will not proc the knockup on multiple targets. Xin Zhao is getting a bunch of AP ratio buffs for this patch, which is why Shiv could have some potential on him now. Since Katarina's R counts as an attack, she's able to proc the Shiv passive 3 times during a full channel. Volibear has some synergy with Shiv, because if he is to proc the energized attack on multiple targets, then you can get your passive stacked faster. I don't know if you guys remember the AD LeBlanc phase from a few years ago, but Shiv being changed in this way could bring back some AD variant builds for LeBlanc. One really interesting item combo of Shiv and Heartsteel is something to keep an eye out on, as you can proc the Heartsteel passive on multiple targets if your Shiv proc is up at the same time. So overall, there's just a lot of potential item combos and new champs that could end up liking static Shiv due to these changes, and we'll be sure to keep you guys updated if any OP builds pop up throughout the patch by updating our new build site whenever we find something new. We have a second item getting a rework, and it's Voltaic Cyclo Sword. So Voltaic will have its cost lowered from 3,000 to 2,900 gold. Lethality is going down from 18 to 10, and its passive is being changed in a big way. So you will no longer stack the energized attack faster based on your distance traveled, and instead abilities will now be able to trigger the energized effect. When you have the energized attack fully charged, instead of your next auto attack dealing 100 bonus damage and slowing the target, your next auto or ability will deal bonus physical damage equal to 10% of the target's current health and grant you 15 lethality for 4 seconds. So the fact that you can now proc the energized attack with abilities, it should now add more viability to the item for a champ who has the potential to poke from range like Zed. Zed throwing out his W into Q during the mid game will hit a lot harder now with Voltaic compared to before, because before you would need to get an auto range to proc the bonus damage, but now you'll get much more consistency out of the passive. Nefiri and Aatrox are tougher to get a read on as to whether they will like this adjustment, because the slow from the old Voltaic was actually quite nice for them to guarantee that they could land their abilities after proccing the slow. There was some crazy item combo that was going around consisting of Shiv and Cyclo Sword that looked to be really OP on Kai'Sa, but based on our most recent PvE testing, it looks like that synergy has been removed by Riot, as Kai'Sa's Q and W do not proc static Shiv's energized damage if you have Voltaic Cyclo Sword. Dusk and Dawn is going to be issued a bit of an overhaul, as a bunch of its stats are being nerfed, with health dropping from 350 to 300, AP going down from 70 to 60, and attack speed being reduced from 25 to 20%. To compensate for all these nerfs, there is a new effect to the passive being added, where you will heal based on 10% of your AP and 3% bonus health. So early game, this is definitely looking like a nerf to Dusk and Dawn. The fact the heal only has a 10% AP ratio and 3% bonus health ratio seems quite weak. If there were a max health ratio, then things would be different, but since it's bonus health, you really won't feel this heal at all until you have a few items. And if you're a champ who doesn't even build any bonus health, then the 10% ratio is super measly. If you have 100 AP, then you'll be healing for 10. That just doesn't seem very strong at all, especially for all the stats you're giving up. So we do think that Dusk and Dawn users likely fall off a bit for next patch, but an assassin like Echo, who doesn't really care for the heal at all, will probably be the most likely to just swap off of Dusk and Dawn entirely. Axiom Arc is going to receive a few changes for this patch, with its passive base cooldown reduction being lowered from 15 to 10%. However, the cooldown reduction lethality ratio is going up from 0.15% per 1 lethality to 0.25% per 1 lethality. To compare that before and after the changes on your 1 item spike, you would have got 2.7 haste from lethality scaling, and then add on the 15 base, and you'd have got 17.7 haste in 26.8. In 26.9, you now have 10 base haste, but the lethality scaling was increased, which means you now get 4.5 haste off of that for a total of 14.5 haste. So 17.7 before and 14.5 in 26.9, which is a nerf on the 1 item spike. What about if you get a second lethality item though? Let's just say you are playing a champ who rushed Hubris like Nefiri. Hubris gets you 18 lethality, so this means you can tack on another 4.5 haste. 14.5 plus 4.5 gives you 19 haste, so that is a small buff compared to the 17.7 from before. So even on 2 items, it's not even that big of a buff if you are running 2 lethality purchases. So if you're someone like Riven, who rushes Axiom and then doesn't even build a second lethality item, she is flat out weaker with Axiom Arc. For someone like Umbessa or Nefiri who go Hubris into Axiom Arc, they get ever so slightly stronger, but nothing to write home about. Overall, a pretty unimpactful change that will only impact Riven at a decent level. A very niche support item is being adjusted for this patch, with Staff of Flowing Water seeing its ability haste lowered from 15 to 10. AP is going down from 45 to 40, and then passive passive will now grant 15 ability haste. So as long as you're healing or shielding champions to proc the passive, then this should be a net positive change to the item because you'll be getting that 15 haste. By no means should this change increase the priority of Staff of Flowing Water, but it will make it a slightly better pickup if you are playing an enchanter support and are paired up with a mage. An item that will be straight up buffed for this patch is Endless Hunger, as Riot will be increasing its bonus AD to haste conversion from 10 to 13%. This is only a buff for melee champions though, so Ezreal players won't get to take advantage of this change. Hecarim is the one champ who has been liking Endless Hunger as a core purchase in recent patches, so he's going to benefit the most, and then you have a few other niche users like Zehen, Riven, and Mbessa who can take advantage of the buff too. And then for the final item change, we have a nerf to Hubris on the way with its AD going down from 60 to 55, passive base AD is down from 15 to 12, and AD per stack is up from 2 to 3. So even though the AD per stack is up, the fact the base damage is down on Hubris should result in these being net nerfs. In order for this to turn into a buff, you're going to need to score 9 takedowns, so across a large enough sample size, you're surely going to be losing relative power from these changes. Graves, Draven, Nefiri, Kiana, Talon, Kha'Zix, Kayn, and Misfortune are the champions who had been running Hubris the most in recent patches, so they will be the most affected by this nerf. So moving on to all the champion changes now. Let's start off up in the top lane, and we've got a buff to Gragas. Gragas W will receive more damage reduction as it's going from 10 scaling to 18% to 10 scaling to 26%. Keep in mind that you max your W out last on Gragas, so the fact the damage reduction stays the same at the first rank in the spell means you won't even start feeling the effects of this buff until you hit level 14. So nothing too crazy with this one. However, top lane Gragas does benefit a lot more than jungle, just due to the fact that top lane can get more experience from the role quest and hit higher levels more reliably, so we likely see top Gragas gain more win rate than jungle. Something we have to consider when analyzing Gragas' potential for 26.9 is the fact that Phase Rush is being replaced by Storm Raider's Surge. Gragas shouldn't mind the change because if he's hitting his combo, then he should be able to take 25% of the target's max health most of the time, but we still aren't super optimistic that the change from Phase Rush to Storm Raiders will be a positive one. So for now, we are going to keep Gragas placed in the top lane A tier. Kennen is going to be a champion we track closely for 26.9 because Riot's giving him more viability with AD crit builds. They're changing his W's so that the empowered attack can now crit for 140% damage. We can see in the comparison clip that this adds a good chunk of damage to Kennen's empowered autos. There's a second change issued where empowered W auto will now synergize with Hurricane so that you can apply your passive to multiple targets due to the Hurricane bolts. And then the last change is to Kennen's E so that whenever he crits, he will extend the duration of his E's attack speed by 1 second. This basically means that if you have 50% crit, you're going to have perma uptime on Kennen's E attack speed if you're constantly auto attacking. So whether these changes actually make AD crit builds viable on Kennen is anyone's guess, as Riot has tried to make AD Kennen viable in the past, but it's just never been a very strong pick for solo queue. The new static Shiv changes make things pretty interesting though, because Shiv is giving you AP now, so could we see a Shiv into Hurricane 2-item core on Kennen? Definitely something we'll be trying out and tracking for this patch, and if any new builds do actually become optimal, then we'll have it updated on our new build site as soon as possible, so be sure to check back throughout the patch. As for Kennen's tier list placement, we aren't going to be moving him anywhere for the time being, as he will remain in the A tier. Teemo is going to receive a couple of small buffs for 26.9, with his E now being applied as an on-hit effect. On-hit damage is now going to scale with 10% bonus AD, and poison damage per tick now scales with 5% bonus AD. Shiv on Teemo is something that could actually have a lot of viability for 26.9. The one thing Teemo really lacks in his kit is that instant wave clear, so if Shiv does end up being viable on him, then it's going to feel really nice. Maybe there's an on-hit build consisting of Shiv, Rageblade, and Dusk and Dawn that pops up. AP Teemo still likely remains the more optimal way to play him, but it would be nice if an on-hit build does become viable so that you can adapt and play a more split push oriented build if the game permits it. So much like Kennen, impossible to get a read on how much power Teemo actually gains from these changes, so we won't be moving him anywhere on the tier list for now, and if anything crazy pops up, we'll be sure to notify you guys in the mid-patch tier list update next week. So there's a bunch of changes that will have direct impact on the top lane meta for 26.9, so let's break it all down. So the most important thing to note is that you should not get baited into running the new starting items in every single game. We gave you the extensive breakdown earlier on in the video, but the TLDR is that Doran's Bow and Doran's Helm are the most greedy starting items, so they most likely are only optimal in matchups where you are very confident you can win. There's a small chance that Doran's Helm could be more optimal than Doran's Shield in all games on champs who have resist scaling in their kits, like Asante or Malphite, but we still think the sustain you get from Doran's Shield will outweigh the power of the resist for the laning phase. Comet being changed so that it's weaker on shorter range champs means Rumble and Malphite likely swap off. Malphite has Grasp he can take instead, while Rumble should be liking the new rune being added called Deathfire Touch. So even with Comet becoming weaker on them, we do feel both champs should have fine alternative options so that their power levels won't drop off a substantial amount if if any at all. The new boots Gluttonous Greaves, which give you lots of Omnivamp, are going to be ones you'll want to try on Aatrox. There aren't too many top lane champions who run Phase Rush as their most common keystone rune, so other than Ryze, we don't think the swap to Storm Raiders should impact the top lane meta too much. Ryze probably gets a bit weaker for this patch because especially for early on in lane, it's just going to be harder to proc Phase Rush now, so it will be interesting to see if he actually likes the new Deathfire Touch rune instead. Based on our analysis from earlier in the video, the Dusk and Dawn changes should negatively impact a few top lane champs, so we're going to drop Kayle out of the OP tier. So onto the jungle now. We've got a buff to Warwick on the way, with his passive damage going up from 6 scaling to 46 to 6 scaling to 55. A pretty nice buff overall for Warwick, considering this is just guaranteed additional damage for a skirmish. Warwick had been tracking around a B and A tier standing over the past few patches, so we think this buff just solidifies him as a good A tier pickup for 26.9. Umbessa has been more popular as a jungler in recent patches, so Riot's going to be hitting the reliability of her skirmish strength by nerfing her R cast time, going from 0.55 to 0.7 seconds. This may not seem like a big deal, but for someone who's playing on higher ping, react flashing Umbessa R can be more difficult, so even getting the slightest little bit more uptime to help compensate for the higher ping can make a big difference. It's really hard to say exactly how much power Umbessa loses though, so we're going to keep her placed in the jungle B tier for now. An OP tier jungler from 26.8 is getting nerfed for this patch, as Briar will have her health growth lowered from 100 to 95. So nothing that will kill Briar at any means, but it should be enough to where she slides out of the OP tier and Nocturne just becomes the standalone best solo queue jungler. Riot has a ton of adjustments cooked up for Shyvana in 26.9, so let's have a look. We've got a few base stat changes, with base attack speed going up from 0.625 to 0.638. Attack speed ratio is going down from 0.69 to 0.638, while AD growth is up from 3 to 4. Q is being adjusted, with the passive damage no longer having an AP ratio. Q on hit cooldown reduction is nerfed, going from 1 to 0.5 seconds, and Q active damage will have its AP ratio increased by 5%. We can see in the comparison clips that this ends up being an 11 damage nerf if you are auto weaving in between Q charges. W is being changed so that the cooldown is down from 14 scaling to 12 seconds to 13 scaling to 9 seconds. W shield is going to have its base value increased, while the ratio is being changed from a 5% max health ratio to a 12% bonus health ratio. W damage will no longer have a 40% bonus AD ratio, but the AP ratio is up from 20 to 65%. We can see that on your 2 item spike, this ends up being a 7 damage buff. The Dragon Form heal from Shyvana W is being changed so that it no longer has a bonus AD or AP ratio, while the base heal and missing health ratio are being adjusted. We can see in the comparison clips that with this change, you will be healing for quite a bit less than before. Lastly, for the E changes, we've got the cooldown dropping from 12 scaling to 10 seconds to 12 scaling to 8 seconds. E damage is being changed in multiple different ways, so to simplify things, let's just look at the comparison clips and we can see that in 26.9, Shyvana E will be dealing 13 less damage if you have the standard build. Keep in mind that Shyvana E is losing its AD ratio while its AP ratio is going up, so if you're playing AP Bruiser Shyvana, then she should benefit from these E changes a bit more. E slow is being altered as well, going from 20 scaling to 40% to 30% flat. So overall, what we're expecting from these changes is that the Kraken Dusk and Dawn Shyvana should get weaker for 26.9. AP builds could see a bit more viability though, but will they be strong enough to overtake the Kraken setup is the big question. There wasn't a single AP build being played at a high rate in 26.9, so we're leaning more towards Shyvana just being a weaker champ for this patch, but if any new builds do pop up that make her stronger, we'll be sure to keep you guys in the loop. Udyr is going to be issued a bunch of changes for this patch, with his Q bonus AD ratios being lowered. However, he's getting some more health scaling on the Q damage. If you were to opt for a standard fighter Udyr build of Trinity Force and Spear of Shojin, we can see from the comparison clips that this is a net nerf to Udyr's Q damage. W is being buffed though, so that the bonus AD ratios are going up, so the shields and heal from W will be stronger for this patch, and the E movement speed will also scale better with bonus AD, with the base and empowered E becoming stronger. So basically, damage is down in exchange for more durability and movement speed, so we'll have to see exactly how these changes land, and we'll be leaving Udyr in the jungle A tier for now. After all, AD builds aren't even the most popular on Udyr anyways, so if you're playing the standard AP Bruiser Udyr, then his power level isn't affected much at all by these adjustments. We could see some crazy off-meta builds emerge on Xin Zhao for 26.9 because Riot will be increasing his AP ratios. Passive AP ratio is being changed from 65% flat to 50 scaling to 75% based on level. W slow duration will now be increased by 0.5 seconds for every 100 AP you have. E AP ratio is going up from 60 to 120%. E bonus attack speed is dropping from 40 scaling to 80 to 38 scaling to 70%. E will now grant 10% bonus attack speed for 100 AP, and bonus attack speed now scales with 1% per 5% bonus attack speed from non-buff sources. So the changes to E especially are heavily incentivizing an AP hybrid setup on Xin Zhao. Could we see a Shiv with Nashor's Tooth core become a thing. The only downside to these AP builds, though, is that you'll be pretty squishy, so I wonder if Riftmaker would need to slot in as a second item for durability. Nevertheless, lots to experiment with for Xin Zhao in 26.9, and we'll be sure to keep you updated if any new optimal builds pop up for him. For Shin's tier list placement, we're going to be keeping him in the S tier, because even if AP builds don't become viable, he was already in a great spot with his standard bruiser builds, and these changes don't significantly affect that. So looking at the jungle tier list with Briar nerfed, we've now got Nocturne as the standalone most OP jungler of the patch. In regards to how the item and rune changes will affect jungle for this patch, here's what you should be paying attention to. Deathfire Touch has the potential to be a good keystone rune on a few junglers, as Karthus and Zyra are the two we think have the most potential. As we mentioned earlier in the video, it looks like champs who can run Conqueror are just better off taking the rune, as Deathfire Touch's damage does not compare when you have a Conqueror fully stacked. So if you were thinking about running Deathfire on Lilia, Amumu, or Udyr, definitely pay attention to stats in the first few days of the patch, because if our calculations are correct, Deathfire might be a bit weak relative to Conqueror. Hecarim is one champion specific who has the potential to see his power swing a lot this patch. Phase Rush being swapped for Storm Raiders is going to affect Hecarim in a big way. The thing with Phase Rush on Hecarim is that it was so easy to proc with just E, W, and Q, and you'd barely need to deal any damage at all to get the proc off. The fact that you now need to deal 25% of the enemy's max health to proc the movement speed means you really have to commit to the fight, and we just feel like this will reduce the consistency of the rune. We could definitely be wrong here because you are getting more movement speed from Storm Raiders, so if that extra movement is actually super impactful, then it could outweigh the fact Storm Raiders is a bit less reliable. Besides Hecarim, Nunu is the one other jungler who ran Phase Rush at a pretty high rate, and we really feel like the reliability of Storm Raiders is going to be so much worse on Nunu. Oftentimes, if you are trying to kite away or run from a fight with Nunu, you just spam your E out, which deals no damage, but it would proc Phase Rush. You won't be able to proc Storm Raiders in that same way, which will really limit the viability of Storm Raiders on Nunu, especially if you're playing from AP Bruiser or Tank. Full AP Nunu, we could still see Storm Raiders being good for him, but for the standard Nunu builds in solo queue, he very likely swaps over to Aftershock, Electrocute, or Dark Harvest as his #1 keystone option. Phase Rush was by far Nunu's best performing keystone rune though, so even if he swaps over, we still feel he's going to lose power for 26.9, so we'll be moving him out of the S tier. Definitely keep an eye out for Storm Raiders on assassin junglers like Talon, Rengar, or Kha'Zix. Any champ that can burst really hard will in theory have the most viability with Storm Raiders, since they can deal 25% of the enemy's max health the quickest. And then watch out for our AP variant Xin Zhao build. The AP ratio buffs he's receiving are pretty massive, so we'll have to see if anything materializes off of those adjustments. With the Dusk and Dawn changes going through, we think Echo is going to be negatively impacted the most. Dusk and Dawn is by far his highest win rate rush item in recent patches, so even if he swaps over to something else, we can't see him gaining power. At best, he stays neutral, but we are expecting Echo to lose power for 26.9, so we'll be moving him into the jungle B tier. Diana is another jungler who could drop down because of the Dusk and Dawn changes, but she can actually benefit from the new heal a bit more than Echo, so we don't think she'll lose as much power, and we'll keep her in A tier for now. Shyvana losing strength for this patch with her standard build, and then also with Dusk and Dawn losing power, means she has the potential to drop down too, so we'll be keeping a close eye on her. So with mid lane Talia being a Phase Rush user, it looks like Riot is expecting her to lose power from the rune being exchanged for Storm Raiders Surge, as they are buffing her damage a bit. Q damage is going up by 5 at all ranks per rock hit. So in regards to Storm Raiders on Talia, we could honestly see it being a decent pickup. Reason being is that you could proc Phase Rush by just hitting multiple rocks from your Q. You needed to hit your Q and then either a WE combo or an auto into E to proc Phase Rush, but if you were strong enough with Talia, then you can now just proc Storm Raiders off dealing damage from Q. This could make it a bit more reliable of a rune for her in the mid to late game, because you're just less reliant on actually hitting your W to get the movement speed. There is a world where Deathfire Touch is strong for Talia too though, so she will have a bunch of options in 26.9. Is this buff enough to propel her out of the B tier though? Probably not, but if we're wrong on that, then we will update you guys for the mid-patch tier list. Zoe is the one other mid laner who's being adjusted for this patch, and to our surprise, she's actually getting nerfed. The cooldown of Zoe's E is going up from 16 scaling to 12 seconds to 18 scaling to 14 seconds. Hitting Zoe's E is now going to refund 16 scaling to 30% of its cooldown. So if you aren't landing your E with Zoe, then it's a nerf, but if you are hitting it, then it's a neutral change early on and a buff later in the game. A lot of the time, you are just looking to toss out Zoe E in a choke to zone, and not always looking to hit it directly, so it's hard to say whether this buff lands net positive or negative. There's a flat out nerf coming through though to Zoe's W, with bolt damage dropping from 60 scaling to 180 to 45 scaling to 165, while AP ratio on W is down from 45 to 30%. So with this W nerf, we definitely think Zoe should be in a weaker state for 26.9. It's strange because she wasn't really heavily overperforming in 26.8, so why exactly she's being nerfed is anyone's guess. We do think Zoe loses a good chunk of strength off of that W nerf, so we'll be demoting her from A into B tier. So in regards to the mid lane tier list for 26.9, we still expect for Xerath to be one of the best champs for solo queue. The changes to Comet are really interesting because they reward you for staying over 750 units away from opponents. Xerath can very easily do this, so he should actually gain power from the Comet adjustments. Vel'Koz, Hui, Lux, Ziggs, and Mel should all be liking the direction of the Comet changes too. A few champs who you might want to swap off Comet for 26.9 include Lissandra and Malzahar. Mal's E has a range of 650 and his R is 700, so he literally cannot gain the max value from Comet now. Liss wants to be right up in melee range when she's engaging fights in the mid game, so Comet value really drops off on her because of that. Liss can just take Electrocute instead, so she's completely fine there, and we think Mal's should like swapping over to Deathfire Touch or Aerie, so we don't see either champ losing power because of Comet becoming weaker on them. Yasuo and Yone will be interesting to keep track of for this patch because the new starting item Doran's Bow that provides 15% attack speed should be viable for both of them. AD LeBlanc has the potential to come back for 26.9 with a Shiv and Cyclosword core build, so watch out for that. And then, as mentioned earlier, Deathfire Touch, if shipped in the state we think it's going to be shipped in, just looks a bit weaker relative to Conqueror. For champs like Ryze, Cassiopeia, or Swain, who you would expect to like Deathfire, they may just end up being better off continuing to run Conqueror. Double tier Ezreal has a legitimate chance of becoming his most optimal build for this patch because of these buffs he's receiving. Riot will be buffing Ezreal's Q AP ratio, going from 15% all the way up to 40%. W AP ratio is being increased from 70 scaling to 90% to 90% flat. And then our AP ratio is up from 90 to 110%. So pure AP builds likely won't be optimal for Ezreal. They never really have been, so we can't see Riot just making AP builds the best for him. What we can see though is a double tier setup where you go Trinity Force into Manamune and then Archangel's Staff. If you've been dozing off this season and haven't been keeping up, Riot changed tier so that you can now buy 2 of them, but your first one needs to be fully stacked and your item upgraded in order for you to purchase your second tier. So what you do is after you've got your Manamune transformed into Mirror Mana, you get a second tier immediately and then build toward Archangels. In regards to Ezreal's tier list placement, we don't think he's actually going to jump up that much in power because you have to keep in mind you won't actually benefit from these buffs until the mid to late game. Pre-3 items, it's still the exact same Ezreal, so we don't think the power he gains after that point will be enough to propel him up the tier list, and he's going to remain in B, but if we were wrong, then we will be the first to let you guys know in the mid-patch tier list next week. Zeri is going to receive a really big overhaul for this patch, and then she also has the potential to benefit from the static shift changes, so lots going on that has the potential to affect Zeri's power level in 26.9. Basic attack range is going to be increased from 500 to 550. Passive execute threshold is going up from 60 scaling to 150 to 70 scaling to 160. Q base damage is being increased, however the AD ratio is going down, and we can see in the comparison clips that this does end up being a damage nerf to Zeri's Q. From 117 to 108 damage per Q when you have one item completed, which is actually a pretty big nerf. W wall crit modifier is going down from 1.75 to 1.5, and we can see in the comparison clip this is a significant nerf as well, with you losing about 46 damage when you're on one item. E is being adjusted so that the base damage is up, however the bonus AD ratio is being removed and the E cooldown is going up from 22 scaling to 18 seconds to 24 scaling to 18 seconds. There's a big buff to E though, to where the cooldown refresh will now apply when attacking anything instead of just when attacking champions. So if you're fighting around an objective, hitting Dragon or Baron, or if you're fighting near a minion wave, then uptime on E will be a lot better for this patch. R is being adjusted so that the burst AD ratio is down from 100 to 60%, so a huge nerf there. The second big buff is to the movement speed you get from Zeri's R, as movement speed per stack is going from 1 to 1.5%, and stack duration is up from 1.5 to 2.5 seconds. So for reference, if you were to hit 10 Qs in a fight with Zeri after using your R, then you will now have 434 movement speed as opposed to just 396 movement speed last patch. So what we can take away from these changes is that Zeri's kiting potential and mobility in fights goes up, but her straight up DPS potential is down. You could look at it in an optimistic way though, where because you're getting more mobility, that could be the difference in you surviving, which would then actually lead to more DPS as opposed to if you just died midway through a fight because you couldn't kite away as well. So whether this lands as net positive or negative is really tough to call, and because of that, we aren't going to move Zeri anywhere in the tier list for now, as we'll have a more accurate rating for you guys in the mid-patch tier list next week. So for ADC in 26.9, it's going to be the introduction of Doran's Bow and the changes to static shiv that you're going to want to pay attention to the most. Doran's Bow is the more greedy starting item because of the fact it offers no health, but does provide 15% attack speed. So we honestly still think that Doran's Blade will be the more consistent default option, but if you're in a matchup where you're extremely confident you won't be pressured at all, then that's where Doran's Bow would fit in best. Let's say you're playing Ashe with Karma and are laning into a Xayah with Yuumi. It's pretty safe to say you're going to have the push in that matchup, and you won't be threatened at all in the 2v2, so going Doran's bow would make sense. Static Shiv likely doesn't have a ton of viability on a wide range of ADCs just because of the fact it now has 40 AP. Senna, Zeri, and Kai'Sa are the 3 ADCs who we expect would have the most viability with the item because they actually have AP ratios on their abilities. Mage's bot could actually even get more disgusting for this patch due to the comet changes and ADC players wanting to experiment with Doran's bow. If an ADC takes Doran's bow and you're playing Ziggs with teleport, then you are easily going to be able to poke them out of lane. The nerf to Hubris is going to reduce the strength of Draven, Misfortune, and Jhin for 26.9. Hubris had been the best performing rush item on MF and Draven, so they will suffer the most, while the item wasn't actually performing that great on Jhin, so he should definitely stop running it now. As a result, we are going to be moving both Draven and MF down 1 tier each for this patch. In the grand scheme of things, ADC meta probably doesn't change much at all for 26.9, as the rune adjustments are less likely to impact the role. We just can't see Storm Raiders and Deathfire Touch being optimal on many ADCs, if any at all, so because of that, there's less probability the role goes through a significant meta shift relative to top, jungle, and mid. Maybe Deathfire could have some viability on Twitch because of his poison, or Storm Raiders on Lucian because of his ability to output considerable upfront burst, but that's definitely more of a long shot. Moving on to support now, Tahm Kench is receiving 2 buffs with his gray health to health conversion going from 45 scaling to 100% to 60 scaling to 100%, so a little bit more sustained for early on with Tahm. And then our Devour ally movement speed is going up from 40 to 60%. So these are buffs 2 patches in a row for Tahm support, which actually has him sitting in a really good spot for the role. It's been a while since Tahm Kench was a higher percentile pick in the support role, but he's a legit A tier pickup now in 26.9. So Tahm Kench is the only support who's being adjusted for 26.9, which means the meta for the role is quite unlikely to drastically change, as we've got Soraka, Sona, and Melio in the OP tier. Enchanters have started to really pull away in recent patches and are outperforming melee supports. It's not that melee supports are bad by any means, as Rel is in a great spot after her recent buffs. Leona, Maokai, and Braum are all quite good too, but those enchanters in the OP tier are just a cut above. Soraka has been really sleeper for a while now, but was just overshadowed by how OP Karma and Nami were. Now that Karma and Nami have been nerfed and are no longer in the OP tier, it's allowed for Soraka, Melio, and Sona to really take over as the best solo queue enchanters. None of the item and rune changes should end up heavily impacting the support meta. There is the change to Comet that could make Xerath and Vel'Koz a bit stronger, and then there was the adjustment to Staff of Flowing Water, which will make the item a better pickup if you're playing an enchanter and have lots of spell-based carries on your team. The passive from Staff of Flowing Water gives your teammate AP and haste when you heal or shield them, so if you have a heavy AP comp or if you're paired with a mage, that's where you will want to consider building the item. For example, Nami can look to run a Core of Mandate into Staff of Flowing Water if she's paired with a mage bot, as you'll be providing them with a ton of bonus damage in fights. Alright guys, one last thing, our rank up guarantee is insane. It's like signing up for the gym and getting a refund if you don't get ripped. That's how confident we are in SkillCapped. We obsess over making the best guides with top players, rigorous testing, and top tier video editing to make your climb easy. If you're ready to level up, visit SkillCapped.com and see the difference. So there you have it everyone, an absolutely massive patch for 26.9, which is something we definitely needed due to how stale the past few patches have been. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you back soon.